It's obviously a moment of significance for Canada, for British Columbia, and certainly for the United States as well. We have heard the President of the United States say that it's his intention to impose tariffs on Saturday, and there has been a repetition of that commitment from key members of the administration. This is obviously a huge concern to British Columbians. And even if they're not directly working in export-related industries, knowing how whole communities rely on jobs that involve exports to the United States are, to this point, closest friends and allies, and in many cases, family members as well. Everything that we are doing in government right now, every decision that we're taking, every action by ministers, is going through the lens of what these tariffs mean for British Columbia and ensuring that we're in position to respond, to support people, support families, and support businesses through this tariff. The federal government today has been indicating that they have prepared measures to support Canadians across the country who may be directly affected by tariffs. I want to assure British Columbians of two things. One is that we're going to work to make sure that the federal government keeps to those commitments, that they treat this as seriously as they did the COVID response. And for our part here in British Columbia, that we will fill in the gaps to make sure that British Columbians are protected. I'll say this too. British Columbians are strong. We are resilient. This is a significant threat. But I wouldn't want to be anywhere else in the world facing a threat like this other than British Columbia. We have the people, we have the skills, we have the access to the port, we have the resources to come out the other side of this threat stronger, more independent, building more things for ourselves, growing more things for ourselves, and building partnerships with countries around the world that want to do business with a strong, democratic country that prioritizes its people and its relationships around the world. And we will make sure that if the tariffs come in, that the lesson that is learned by the United States is that we are tough. There is no free lunch here in Canada or in British Columbia. We will support the federal government on matching tariffs. We'll do our part in BC to identify other ways of making sure that every harm that is inflicted on British Columbia families is met and matched with a response to the United States. With that, I'm happy to take your questions and look forward to our discussion here today.
Thank you, Premier, and thank you everyone for joining us here today at Canada Place. We have media here in person and on the phone lines. All reporters will have one question and one follow-up. We're going to start here at Canada Place with Brenna Owen from the Canadian Press.
Thank you. Premier, so you've just mentioned the pandemic-style kind of relief plans. Could you just provide a little bit more detail on what this could look like here in BC?
Thanks. There's a couple components to supporting people through this period. One is that we know that part of the proposed federal response is retaliatory tariffs on the United States on billions of dollars of U.S. imports into Canada. That'll result in the federal government collecting a significant amount of money that should be immediately deployed across the country to affected individuals and businesses to help them survive and to diversify their markets and to move to other markets other than the United States. Obviously, Ontario and Quebec, with their integrated auto market with the United States, are in a very different position than British Columbia, but BC families will need support during this period as well. Employment insurance for people who are laid off temporarily as employers face canceled orders potentially from the United States, some of which we're hearing already. For businesses where their order books are drying up as their customers try to figure out how to deal with this, that they have access to cash to be able to stay open and to weather this and identify new markets. Whatever it takes to make sure that we come out the other end stronger is very important. Through COVID, we supported businesses here in British Columbia with grants to be able to get through. The federal government had loans. They provided people supports who were laid off through employment insurance. These are the kinds of responses that we expect to see through this period The projections that we have seen indicate that this could be more serious for our provincial economy than the 2008 recession, and certainly the most severe economic impact we've seen in a while here in Canada and British Columbia. And unfortunately, it'll have significant effects on the Americans as well. I think there's still time for President Trump to work with us, because there is a strong desire on the part of the premiers and the federal government to address the concerns the president has raised. This isn't a fight we asked for. We don't want it. We don't need it. But we are willing to respond to these tariffs proportionately and as is required. We're willing to fight for our country.
Follow up, Brenna?
Thank you. So your government is going to be delivering a budget soon. So how can you make these plans? How is this tariff threat affecting the plans when there's still so much doubt around whether this is going to come to pass?
Thanks. And that's an important thing that I want British Columbians to know, is as our finance minister is pulling together the budget, as she's doing the work with her team in the Ministry of Finance, every decision is being made through the lens of British Columbia and Canada potentially heading into a protracted trade war with the United States, and all the consequences that that could mean for families around lower dollar resulting in higher costs for groceries, around potential impacts to employment, and everything that brings with it, including the inability to make payments on your house, whether it's rent or a mortgage. This is a big deal for families. We're going to make sure that we have the resources available to support people, whatever the consequences are. There's always the possibility that we don't see those kinds of impacts, or we don't see the tariffs, or they're different than were advertised. You just never know. And so hopefully, we'll hope for the best. But British Columbia should know that we are preparing for the worst. And we're going to be in a position to support them alongside the federal government.
Thank you, Premier. Next, we'll head to Jack Morris from City News.
Thank you. So we've heard some other provinces doing things to try to address, at least what Trump says are his concerns, such as deploying conservation officers. Are you looking at anything here in BC to address these border concerns that Donald Trump has raised as part of these tariff threats?
So we've made repeated commitments to the federal government that as part of a coordinated border effort across the country, we're willing to do whatever's necessary to support that. But what we won't be doing here in British Columbia is taking over the responsibility of the federal government along the border. It's federal government responsibility for a reason. It runs through every province. Having piecemeal responses is try everything. I don't criticize my colleagues for doing this. But really, this does need to be a nationally coordinated effort. And frankly, that's why I have made the case to the Prime Minister directly that there needs to be some consistency at the federal level between the federal Liberal leadership race, the very strong likelihood of an upcoming federal election, and regardless, a new administration, whatever the party is, post-election, that there needs to be some consistency in the federal government response across the country. And that means an individual or individuals that won't be out campaigning during a federal election, that aren't swept up in the Liberal leadership race. And the premiers will do our part. But there are core responsibilities that the federal government cannot avoid that we need them to do, which includes our relationships with other countries, protecting the border, responding to the border concerns, responding to the call for additional military investments. And I'm a big fan of Dom LeBlanc. I think he's a great guy, and I wish him the best. But he is also going to be in a federal election as well. And having that consistency throughout this period is going to be absolutely crucial. And unfortunately, we have not yet seen that response from the federal government, that they're going to have that consistent presence through an election federally and out the other side.
Do you have a follow-up, Jack?
I do. So you've been talking a lot about everything being on the table, about concerns, about being able to provide some of the things that were promised throughout the election. It's a word that people are avoiding, but are we entering an austerity period now?
Well, I mean, the concern that I have is that on our own internal projections, we're showing that these tariffs will put British Columbia into a recession provincially, and also extremely likely that it will do the same federally. BC is the least affected province by the proposed tariffs on our measurements. And when we look at provinces like Ontario and Quebec, the impacts could be quite devastating. And that is not even to talk about the impact on Americans of more expensive everything from pasta to electricity to filling up at the pump. So a lot of people are going to be hurt by this on both sides of the border. And the response from our government is we're going to make sure the frontline services are there for people that they're counting on, the healthcare, the education, all of those pieces. It is requiring, and you see it in the mandate letters to all my ministers, for every single minister to look at the programs in their ministries and say, does this meet the moment now in 2025 of tariffs and the situation that we face and the supports people need? Or is this responsive to the concerns of 2017 or 2020 or 2022? And so if it doesn't meet the moment for tariffs, then it has to be revisited and redirected to the support that people need. I think that British Columbians and Canadians are like myself. We were all hoping that the president was just angling for a negotiation around our free trade agreement across North America. But it seems very likely that he is committed to imposing these tariffs, even if they harm Americans, even if they harm Canadians. And so we need to be prepared for that, even though it makes absolutely no sense.
Thanks, Premier. Next, we're going to head to the phone lines and start with Rob Shaw from Czech News.
Thanks. Great moderation today. Premier, just wanted to ask, it's been a couple of weeks here of you talking about this economic war that might be occurring, with Ottawa talking about retaliation, with you talking about retaliation. Doesn't seem to have done anything to change Donald Trump's trajectory in the White House today, reiterating February 1st. So I'm just wondering, the reality that you're up against, the world's biggest economy and greatest superpower, and a president with control of the House and the Senate, what chance do you actually stand up against here to influence the president's movements?
Thanks, Rob. British Columbians are strong. Just going to let that helicopter pass. It's one of the ones we're sending down to the border. Mr. President. Air ambulance. British Columbians are strong, they're resilient, they're tough. Canadians are the same. And there's no question we're up against a superpower. And if the president wishes to use the might of the United States to attack families in Canada with the aim of getting us to agree to be the 51st state, then he's going to do it. And what I can tell him is, and what I can tell Americans is, that will only hurt Americans, and that will also hurt Canadians. It makes absolutely no sense. These are unjustified tariffs, and it may be that the only way for that message to be delivered is for Americans to actually feel the pain and the consequences of this visited on them by Canadian retaliation against these tariffs. And they're going to see impacts even if we did nothing. They'll see higher prices. But I believe that we can step up that pain, that we can target it to specific Republican districts where there is support for this agenda, and get the attention of folks about how integrated we are. This is like family members fighting. This is longtime friends refusing to talk to each other. It is bizarre. We have so many shared priorities and interests and shared prosperity. But we will not back down just because the bully is more powerful and bigger than us. Canadians have never backed down because of that, and we're certainly not going to change that today.
Do you have a follow-up, Rob?
Sure, yeah. Slightly changing topics here. Ottawa has cut your immigration numbers in the province under the provincial nominee program. It seems suddenly, and they're suggesting that if the province takes more asylum seekers, you might get more PNP spots. Can you respond to that? Because I know it affects some areas like healthcare and education, these spots, and it looks like there's thousands fewer this year than last year.
Yeah, Rob, anyone who's trying to make sense of federal immigration policy these days, and frankly, for the last few years, will really struggle to make sense of it. the majority of the users of our food banks in British Columbia are people who have been in the country for fewer than 2 years. The overwhelming concern in Ontario and Quebec of unaddressed flows of asylum seekers and the fact that they don't have space for people to stay, that they're having to rent motels to accommodate this failed federal policy. And then now for British Columbia to be told that our stream of skilled immigrants, the people that we know we need to ensure that our economy keeps moving in a moment of huge stress on our economy, to be cutting that and say, no, you don't get access to those engineers, you don't get access to those technicians, the programmers, the doctors, the childcare workers. You don't get access to those people unless you agree to help us solve a problem we've created in another province with non-existent housing. We don't have any space to put these asylum seekers. It's an insult. And so I'm hopeful that we see a coordinated response at the federal level to the new realities that we're facing right now with these tariffs. And I was profoundly disappointed by what we were presented by the federal government on this, and hopeful that new leadership within the federal Liberal Party quickly addresses this to put a lens of what is best for the country and what supports our economy in a moment of stress on this, instead of reacting to whatever the last week's news story was.
Thanks, Rob. Next, we'll head to Richard Zussman from Global News.
Hey, Premier, thanks so much for taking my question. One of the things you've mentioned is interprovincial trade barriers. What is holding up trade amongst provinces right now, and do you believe there's any resolution ahead? And talking about stability, with Doug Ford off to election, is there any clarity in terms of who's going to be leading the way when it comes to cost throughout the Ontario election?
Yeah, I think the challenge with interprovincial trade for provinces is it's always the second or third or fourth priority of the things that we're talking about. There's always something more pressing. It's moments like these when we realize that it's easier to trade with Washington State than it is to trade with Ontario for key products, that the message really hits home. Man, if we're going to respond to these tariffs, if we're going to be successful in this tariff battle, we got to buy each other's stuff across Canada. We got to buy Canadian first. We got to take our own advice. And so I'm hopeful that this moment is one in which all premiers, we all have our key industries, our key pieces that we're trying to ensure we're responsive to. I know we've, as one example, we've had a lot of discussions with Ontario about wine, being able to ship BC wine direct to consumer in Ontario, just like we do with Alberta now. And I'm sure they have their own priorities with us, things that we do that they find frustrating. These are the moments where we can expand markets across Canada. We can trade and build up our country. And we're all going to have to take a bit of a haircut in terms of those political priorities, but the net effect will be increased prosperity and wealth across the country. Another example that's front of mind for me is trucks, long-haul truck drivers. Different requirements around training and licensing all across Canada, different logs that have to be kept. We can harmonize these standards and have trade roll across the country much more easily for these companies as well. In terms of the decision of Mr. Ford to call an election, I always hesitate in commenting on the sort of political decision-making of other leaders. I'll say this, I think that Mr. Ford has been a good chair of the Council of Federation. I agree strongly with his message that retaliation is required in this moment, that we can't just roll over, that we need to be strong as Canadians, and I'm grateful for his message on that. It does bring additional challenge for him to be both the chair of the Council of Federation and running an election at the same time. And I've urged him to ensure that he is prioritizing the chair role, and he assured me that that will be the case through this period. And I know with the federal leadership and election race as well, none of this is ideal, but there really is no ideal time for a tariff war. And so my hope is that this does not interfere at all with the mission that we have to Washington, D.C. on the 12th. There's no indication I've seen that it will interfere. And I look forward to heading down with the premiers and each of us using our strengths and our connections to bring the message to the Americans about the harm this is going to do to the United States of America as well as Canada, and that it's all absolutely needless.
Follow up, Richard?
Premier, we're still hearing stories about staff being exposed to dangerous drug smoke in hospitals and having to be treated and sent home. Your government has attempted to tackle this extra security. Is there an acknowledgement that that's not working, and what else can be done to keep health workers safe?
Yeah, we have a cohort of people in the province with serious brain injury, mental health issues, and addiction issues. I've heard stories from psychiatrists and nurses of people almost reflexively lighting up drugs during interactions with them because they are so affected by their addictions or mental health issue and the brain injury that they are unable to make decisions that are responsive to where they find themselves. It's an emergency room, it's a psychiatrist's office, and their behavior is completely out of line for their own health as well as the health and safety of the people around them. It's why we're doing the work with Dr. Vigo to identify the cohort of a disproportionate number of incidents like this, concentrated in a relatively small number of people, to intervene with this group, to get them into the intensive medical care and support that they need. They should not be sitting in the emergency room night after night. We have one individual that's been identified that's been in the emergency room more than 150 times in a single year. This is not the way to respond to these challenges. There is no way that that person being in the emergency room night after night is improving their safety or their health outcomes or the safety or health outcomes of the people around them. And so we're intervening with this population, and that systemic fix is going to address this. You can put up all the no smoking signs you want in the hospital. There's a group of people with serious brain injuries that they cannot read the signs. They are too high, they are too injured, they are too sick, and they need to be removed by security, and that doesn't help anybody. So intervening more proactively, getting them the care they need, this will make our healthcare environments and our communities safer as a whole for them and for everybody else.
Thanks, Richard. We have time for one more question, and we'll head to Katie DeRosa with CBC.
Hi, Premier. The report on foreign interference had some section on the electoral race in Steveston, Richmond East. What stands out to you from that report? Are there any concerns that you would like to see followed up on?
Well, I haven't had the chance to read the report in detail, but I can tell you from personal experience that I am still unable to get the information from Canada's Intelligence Service or from the RCMP about any incidents involving political interference with BC elections or with elected officials. And that strikes me as a big problem. As a leader of a political party, the fact that that even despite the reforms that were made to the CSIS Act, that I am not and cannot and for whatever reason I'm being blocked from being briefed about any issues that may affect at least our political party, if not the province as a whole in terms of political interference, is a problem. And so I hope as the federal government looks at how the reforms they made earlier are working out, as they look at the recommendations from this report, I think the province has a role to play in directing resources to prevent foreign interference, but we can only do it if we know where to direct those resources and how to weed this out. And we're ready to do the weeding. We just need a little help in identifying where the problem is.
Do you have a follow-up, Katie?
Yeah, on the issue of asylum seekers and our provincial nominee numbers, the immigration minister seemed to suggest that other provinces are not doing their part and they're not taking in a proportionate number of asylum seekers. If the government were to, cough up some money, would BC take more? Is BC doing enough to fulfill its obligations to asylum seekers and not just skilled immigrants?
Thanks, Katie. Sorry to interrupt you. We got another helicopter landing here. I can't speculate about the intentions of the federal government on this file. We are taking in a record number of asylum seekers here in British Columbia. People are well aware of the housing crisis. I think directing refugees and vulnerable people into the hottest housing market in North America with record low vacancy rates is probably not the best strategy. And I feel like most British Columbians would nod along with that. But in any event, British Columbia is always willing to do our part. We're always committed to, whether it was in relation to Ukraine or any of the other urgent circumstances that have come up where people need to be relocated to respond. But what I want to see from the federal government is readiness around the border, especially with President Trump policies about deportations. If we see a sudden surge of people at the border, are they ready for that? Or are they too busy dealing with last week's news story instead of thinking ahead to what's coming for us and making sure that we're prepared? That's my message for them. I know there are a lot of distractions federally right now. I know there's a lot of discussion and posturing related to the leadership race and everything else, but we need a strong presence at the border to address those issues, to address President Trump's concerns, to address my concerns and the concerns of other premiers across Canada. And I hope that the new leader of the federal Liberal Party is ready to hit the ground running on these issues because a strong reset is definitely needed.
Thank you, Premier, and that concludes today's event. Thank you, everyone, for joining
Thanks
us
very much.
at Canada Place, and have a
Here's Premier David Eby urging the federal government to focus on the threat of President Donald Trump's tariff threats. We'll do a quick summary for you before we wrap up here. David Eby saying they are doing everything in government, the BC government, going through the lens of what these tariffs mean in BC and to help support people, businesses, etc. When it comes to pandemic-level relief plans, and this is what he's calling for, he says money gathered from counter tariffs, if Canada does impose those on American goods, should be immediately dispersed across the country. He says BC families will need support, employment insurance for people who are laid off, for businesses in order to find more other customers and make sure they have access to more money and find other customers if those tariffs come on. He noted that during COVID, the BC government gave out grants for businesses to stay open. Ottawa did loans, and he notes that the projections they have seen is that tariffs, and they have been, the president has suggested they'd be at 25%. The impact of those could be more serious than the 2008 recession, also known as the Great Recession, and it will have significant impacts, as he said, on the U.S. as well. He says there is a strong desire from the premiers and the prime minister to work with Donald Trump to address his concerns around border crossings and drugs. He said, "We did not ask for this fight, but we will still respond." David Eby also asked about how this is going to impact BC budget plans, because there is a budget coming up. He says the finance minister is right now making every decision through the lens of a protracted trade war that could mean a lower dollar leading to higher prices for groceries, rent, mortgages. And they want to make sure, he says, we will make sure we have the resources in place to help people. He says BC is less vulnerable than other provinces, for example, Ontario and Quebec, with their integrated auto supply chains with the United States. He noted that he has also been asking the Prime Minister for some consistency from Ottawa, regardless of the federal Liberal leadership race and a possible election, federal election, and a possible government change, that somebody is honing in, focused solely on the impending trade tariffs and protracted trade war, if there is one, should these tariffs go through. He was asked whether we are having to prepare for an austerity period in BC. He says tariffs will likely put BC into recession as well as Canada. Again, he thinks that BC will be the least impacted province. That is what we heard from Premier David Eby. We'll have much more on our website throughout the day and on radio, cbc.ca/BC. I'm Dan Burrett, and we'll see you at 4 p.m.